perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello, and thank you again for being with us. Today, our guest is Dr. Lawrence Powell with the History Department at Tulane University. And we're going to talk to Dr. Powell about his great new book. But before we do that, I see in your material that you are the director of the New Orleans Gulf South Center. What is that?
Well, it's a research center to promote research and education and community engagement around issues of the Gulf South, mainly cultural and historical issues. And we support conferences. We grant fellowships to scholars who are doing research on the music, the history, the culture, the literature of the Gulf South. We support graduate students and a lot of conferences. Right now we are administering a generous grant from what's called the Music Rising initiative. The Music Rising was a initiative of what I like to describe as cultural first responders after Katrina. And they put a lot of money into replacing the instruments that were lost and destroyed in the storm.
Yes.
For both musicians and then for school bands and for churches as well. And we're trying to create a website and a curriculum at Tulane, and also a online curriculum that will be available globally in the awful event that another Katrina arose, hit our coast and did even more damage and destroyed the musical culture.
It wasn't the hurricane that got us; it was the flood.
The federal flood.
It was the flood.
Federal flood of 2005.
Well,
but if one happened to come with even more ferocity and somehow wiped us out, we would like to leave a historical footprint that later generations could look to and perhaps reproduce the music and the culture.
Well, that's all very interesting. I attend a monthly round table luncheon at the Fontainebleau Hotel, and most of the people there have to do with some element of culture in the city, whether it's the symphony, the opera, art galleries. And I think that this New Orleans, as compared with other cities in the country, has to be at the top of a city with a great variety of cultural activities and history. And what you're doing, that's great that you're assisting the continuation of our culture.
And to preserve and perpetuate and to champion the culture. It's a deep culture, deep roots, a vernacular culture particularly, and it's one that's uniqueness, I think, depends upon where it is, the fact that we're perched on this swamp that's always at risk of a catastrophe, man-made and otherwise. And this is the way the people have mixed here. I mean, this is a city that originated from a different Afro-European foundation than the rest of America.
Yes.
And it's exceptional. And because it's exceptional, it's actually relevant. Some people, historians in particular, like to argue, well, New Orleans is, you know, it's atypical, and it doesn't really have anything to teach the rest of America, but I think the evidence suggests otherwise.
And that brings us to your book, the title of which is The Accidental City, Improvising New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And I became aware of your book through a beautiful write-up in the Times-Picayune newspaper very recently. And they say here, Lawrence Powell's acclaimed history of New Orleans reads like colorful fiction, but explains why the city is important. Tell us about your book.
Well, the book itself is something of an accident in two ways. It was not a book I was prepared to write beginning in 2006 when I really started to focus in on it to the extent I could because of teaching and other responsibilities. It's a Katrina book, although Katrina is only mentioned once in the entire text and twice if you include the acknowledgments. Katrina,
because that was your stimulus to write it?
It was the impetus to do this. I really, at the time I began this, I named the book, or the working title was New Orleans, an American Pompeii, ? My fear was that it wasn't going to recover because the devastation looked just overwhelming. And
it's incredible that there were people on the national scene who said they should never have built that city below sea level. Just get rid of it and get rid of the problem.
That's right.
There were people who said that.
Well,
and when I drive around New Orleans and look at the skyline, all the skyscraper buildings, how could someone say just demolish all that?
Well, know-nothings. And some of them were in power in high places, including the former Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. And that was also a goad to write about this. And I felt, well, I need to answer those, those churlish critics. And I didn't like the condescension in which that insulting question was flung in our face. And that was one of the spurs to write the book. The other accident about it is the way in which the book unfolded, because my original intention in my contract with Harvard was for me to write an overview history going from primordial ooze to Katrina sludge. I was going to do everything within, within 300 pages of a
That's a pretty expansive time, yes.
And I would be doing it at probably 35, maybe 65,000 feet. And it was with a mood of pessimism that I began this book. It was almost like a dirge, I think. But as I got into the story, the book took a different course. And it took a different course for two reasons. One, I discovered I couldn't answer this question that these unkind critics were hurling our way about why are we here, why we were so stupid to build here, and why resuscitate the town. I couldn't write that in 2 or 3 paragraphs or 2 or 3 pages as I initially envisioned that I could. And that's because the answer about why we were here was a lot more complicated than I had assumed. I had assumed, following the geographers, that it was here because this is the only place you could place a city close to the mouth of the river and control the river.
So you did not go back to the primordial ooze?
Well, I did, actually.
Oh, did you? All right.
I mean, I began, because you have to, part of one of the characters in this book is the river itself.
Okay.
Because it's a dynamic river, and this is a dynamic delta that we are perched on. And I had to spend some time explaining how this land formed and why it's shaped the way it is, why human habitation has to stay close to the river, or had to stay close to the river until they drained the back swamp. So I had to spend a little bit of time doing that. That I anticipated. But the other thing I didn't think I'd have to do is spend a lot of time explaining why humans decided to build here. And that's the accident in the title, because this was an accident. It was an accident of history. The proprietors of Louisiana at the time that New Orleans was founded very much wanted to place the new capital, the new headquarters of New Orleans, which they named after the regent of France, the Duc d'Orléans. They wanted to place it up near Baton Rouge at a place called Bayou Manchac.
On solid ground.
It would be solid ground, and they anticipated coming through the back door, through the lakes, through past Manchac, into the Iberville River, and then into Bayou Manchac, which connected with the river for 6 months of the year, and they were going to dredge it out so it would be 12 months. And when Bienville decided he wanted to put the city here, in the footprint it presently occupies, he did it without orders. And he gave himself most of the land, him and his cronies. I mean, if you look at uptown New Orleans, everything above Canal Street to Jefferson Parish, that was all of Bienville's concession. So it's a kind of a land jobbing scheme.
Mm-hmm. And that was the highest part of the ground, wasn't it?
Well, when you go back, it's not. But I mean, he gave himself all that land, and including the highland.
Okay.
And then he gave himself a large swath of territory on the West Bank, too. So he had a lot of the West Bank. He was ordered to vacate, to evacuate, to relocate.
Ordered by what?
Ordered by the board of directors, both in Paris and in Biloxi, which is where the company had two headquarters, the Company of the Indies. This was a company organized by a Scottish financier and gambler and banker by the name of John Law. And they didn't want the place here. But for one of the great stock market crashes in the history of financial capitalism, it would not be here. It would have been relocated up in Baton Rouge, or near Baton Rouge. And that's the accidental part of the story. It took me about 3 chapters just to tell that story and to bring the Bienville and his brother and his cronies to life. And I felt that was, I had to do that in order to explain why we're here. And that changed the course of the book. One of the things changed the course of the book.
All right. Well, then from that point forward, I presume you covered New Orleans, what, up to the present time?
No. You mean in this book?
In your book?
No, I could only get up to about 1812, or the Battle of New Orleans in 1815.
All right.
Because if you spend, 3 chapters on the first 20 years of the city's history, there's no way you can sustain maintain that intensity of attention to detail without coming out with a 3-volume, 1,000-page book. That wasn't going to work. And I either had to throw this material out, or I had to say, well, maybe I just need to talk about this foundational period of the French, Spanish, and the early American, territorial period.
All right. Well, what were some of the interesting events during that period? Well,
it's a story of how the city kind of built itself. It kind of was improvised out of many cultural elements and many kinds of people from various ethnicities in Africa, the kinds of Francophone people who came down here from Canada, including, trappers, coureurs de bois, they were called, soldiers of fortune, vagabonds and vagrants who were offloaded here as though this was an early Australia, a penal colony almost, and the Native American population as well. And I had to explain how how slavery evolved, how it had a very interesting history here. I mean, everything about this place was somewhat topsy-turvy.
Well, New Orleans was a major slave market, was it not?
Well, it became the new, well, at least in the United States, the major slave mart from, say, 1810 to 1860. But before that time, it was not a major slave mart. But it did have a significant slave population.
And during that time, was it during that time that there were free people of color here and the Creoles?
That also evolved kind of accidentally. I mean, it's a story of contingencies, and I wanted to explain how how people made their own identity, including free people of color. And it's very much tied up with the history of slavery, or the strange history of slavery in the New Orleans area, in Colonial Louisiana. And basically, when you talk about Colonial Louisiana, for most of that period, you're basically talking about the environs of New Orleans. Most of the population was concentrated in and around New Orleans, you know, the river parishes and below New Orleans. And slavery here had this two-step forward, one-step backward quality. It began with a big bang. It didn't evolve gradually. It just all of a sudden, overnight, the Company of the Indies, John Law's company, who founded New Orleans, decided this was going to become a tobacco colony. And part of the agreement for taking over the colony, for taking ownership, taking title to it, is that they were going to make this Louisiana the sole source of tobacco for all of France, because it was becoming too dependent upon tobacco re-exported from Virginia and Maryland. And so overnight they created a plantation society on the Mississippi, except it went bust after about 10 years for a variety of reasons. And now these planters, these concessionaires, have all these slaves on their hands, but they don't have any market for the crops that they thought they would be growing. So they pretty much had to kind of give them a free rein. They said, go feed yourself, raise vegetable gardens, hawk the food in town, share your revenue with us. They trained them to be craftsmen, told them to go out and hunt and sell the game in town, to fish, to trap, to do lumbering. And so very quickly, the slave population became the skilled sector of the population.
As opposed to the slaves in other southern states.
Yes. I mean, you see a little bit of that in other southern states, but not to the extent that you see it here. And so what it meant is that they were gaining some independence, even as slaves, and starting to put away some income, even as slaves, owning property, even as slaves, traveling around the colony with guns and without passes, even as slaves. This was unique. And then when Spain took over and they introduced a more liberal manumission regime, manumission being private act of emancipation, the slave population was poised to buy their way out of slavery, because one of the innovations of Spanish slavery was the right of self-purchase. And you see this huge spurt in the growth of the free colored population in New Orleans.
Now, was there, because something that pops into my head is the quadroon ballroom in the French Quarter. Quadroon means there was sexual relationships between white and slave people. Is that covered in your story?
Is, and it's extensive. It's extensive, and what's striking about it, it's open and it's acknowledged. Much more. I mean, you'll find this kind of thing happening anywhere you have slavery, because one of the fruits of slavery and the fruits of colonization is the sexual conquest of women. And so you'll find this, it's a word I wish I could get rid of, miscegenation, because it was invented around the time of the Civil War to suggest mongrelization, racial mixing. But there was a lot of racial mixing, and it was mainly, there was a lot of cohabitation between free white men and slave women, or free women of color eventually.
And these men had wives, and
these actually, some of them did, but actually these were relationships that might last 50 years.
I see. Okay.
And they would be sometimes at the very top of the social hierarchy. Now that begins to evolve later in the Spanish period. But what's striking is how willing a lot of men were who fathered slave children to acknowledge the paternity and to free them and to set aside, in any way they could, to set aside some competence, some property that they could use. And that was another thing that helped to spur the growth of this population.
Now, your book does not come up to present times, but is there still in New Orleans a distinction for these later children of those relationships back then, where they were sort of elite at that time? Do people still claim that's my background?
Yeah, I think more so. There was a period, I think it's gone through phases. I mean, there was a period where they were trying to self-consciously separate themselves from American Protestant blacks. Mm-hmm. Some of it racial, some of it was a kind of a skin consciousness, light skin consciousness. Some of it was just cultural. They're proud of their kind of French Catholic traditions. And then with the civil rights period and Black is Beautiful, I think that generation wanted to reinvent themselves as black people, as rather than a distinct mm-hmm. group. I'm not sure what's going on today. There is this, I don't believe we're entering into any post-racial society, but it's a different racial order. People are more identified in themselves as multiracial, and I think on the census, if I'm not mistaken, people have the option of checking off more than one racial box.
Yes, that is true. Now, do you also cover our heritage regarding food and recipes that came from that culture?
Well, in passing. I mean, I don't know enough to go too deeply into that without giving the reader indigestion. So I talk about how this improvisational food culture was constantly churning and made up of different elements, and it was constantly being creolized. And I should point out right now that I do original research in this book, and I've been in the archives and quite a bit, but it's a work of synthesis. So I'm very much standing on the shoulder of other historians who've written about this, and archaeologists and anthropologists. So I don't want to claim a lot of originality here. What's original about the book is I think I've put it all together for the first time.
I think it's in your presentation, and as I was reading in the Times-Picayune, your book has gotten acclaim from the Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, the Wall Street Journal, not necessarily as a history book, but because it's good reading.
Yeah.
When someone may say, well, this is a professor of history from Tulane University, they may think that it's not going to be exciting reading, but from all that I can see, you can keep people's interest.
Well, thank you, and I do try to do that. I mean, I don't think I'll keep everyone's interest because there are parts of it will be you can't curl up with it at night. I mean, you'll have to pay attention and work at it. I mean, I don't put obstacles in the way. I try to put it in language that I think will keep the reader turning the pages. It's very gratifying to see general readers say this is a good read.
Yes. Well, when you're talking about turning pages, you might want to hold up your book so people can see what it looks like.
Sure. Yeah,
that's the book, The Accidental City.
Improvising New Orleans.
Now, I have another question, because you're taking it up to a certain 1812 or thereabouts. You have plans to do a sequel?
I do. In fact, I'm under contract to do a sequel. Because this is not the book I was given in advance to write. They had to write it. I had to agree to another contract to finish this book. So right. Yes, and I'm going to finish the story. I probably won't write it in this way. I'll probably have to step back a little bit and not write it with so much attention to detail and the complexities of it. But
in your research, what were some of the surprising things that you discovered?
Well, I guess just the contingency of it all. I mean, and I've been teaching Louisiana history for years, and I would write about the colonial period, or teach about the colonial period, I should say, and it had a certain formulaic unfolding in my mind at that time and in the way I presented it to my generations of students. But when I got into the weeds of the story and had to think about it and then read this vast literature that I only had a passing familiarity with, which included literature on the Spanish Empire and how things worked there, and on the French Empire and the complexity of African slavery, then I realized, boy, this is really a complicated, much more complicated place than I ever imagined. And the way people have learned to coexist here and share a culture by building a culture, I guess this surprised me, now that you asked me that question.
All right. Now, you did mention earlier that you had went into the archives. What archives were those?
Well, mainly the colonial archives down at the State Museum in the Old Mint, the Louisiana History Center. I mean, I did look at some things from Minnesota Historical Society and some things from, I think from LSU. It's kind of a blur. And also from Princeton. I went in and read some private manuscripts there.
But there is a great deal of material available for that kind of research.
There is, and I have colleagues who have really delved into this and still are, discovering and rediscovering the true riches of our local archives, the notarial archives being one, the sacramental records being another, the records of the Superior Council and the Cabildo being yet others, the court records. It's just a candy store of opportunity, and for so long it's been neglected by historians in North America. But now there's this budding interest in New Orleans and seeing it as a part of a broader Atlantic world.
There is, I think, national interest in our city, stimulated by the Katrina catastrophe. We're out of time. I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you folks for watching our show, and we hope to see you again soon.